we live in the era of genocide, Rory. Joe Rogan is on a moral platform infinitely higher than anybody on Fox News, CNN, ABC, because Joe Rogan may interview awful genocidal people, but he also interviews people who say what's happening in Palestine is a genocide. Like, he actually interviews people who acknowledge humanity and what's going on.
Hello and welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast. I'm Murray, in charge of podcasting, and in charge of politics is Rob. How are you this week?
Oh, well, man, I don't know. It's a whole range of emotions, I guess.
I'm just very I'm confused because everyone keeps saying Harris has lost, doesn't have a chance, things aren't looking good, but I just don't think Sinn Féin's that powerful. I don't think they'll win. I think Simon Harris still has a lot to do and the election isn't over yet.
I'm sadly not as up enough on those politics to fully get the joke, but
The most important election of the year of elections is going to be Ireland. So the last one is the most important.
Really? Oh, that's how that
Yes.
works? That's how that works. Well,
Yes.
I'll certainly have to bone up on the Irish
So
election.
what country is it we're doing this week? Or was there an election in Armenia?
It's the United States of America, not, in fact, Armenia, Rory. We're going to be talking about
that
an
country all
election
those Canadian actors migrate to.
Yes, exactly. A famous
Okay,
refuge.
I think I've heard of it.
Yeah, for those who can't make it in Canada, they move to the United States to try and eke out a sort of like a basketball player going to Turkey or something. Yeah. So yeah, we had an election in the United States. It did not go well for the Democrats. Donald Trump is pulled off a Grover Cleveland, is what we call it. Donald Trump is the second president in U.S. history to have two non-contiguous, there's that geographical term, but have two terms apart from each other. Grover Cleveland was the last person to do this towards the end of the 1800s. Actually, no, Grover Cleveland was the first person to do this at the end of the 1800s, and now Donald Trump has done so as well. I think first off, I should say I was wrong about this. I think that pretty much, so for all of the elections since 2016, I've been pretty good about predicting the results. I was quiet about it in 2016, but I had a hunch that Hillary Clinton would lose. And the midterms and big elections since I've called right. I called this one incorrectly. I thought that Biden would win until, of course, it became clear that he absolutely wouldn't in June. But I thought that the Democrats would be successful. I thought that people would remember that Donald Trump was president once and it didn't work out so well. But I was wrong. I guess I underestimated the level of rage that there was towards Joe Biden and the Biden administration. And apparently Donald Trump is a gamble that the majority of the American people are willing to take. I don't think that's the right choice, but it is the choice that has been made.
I'm shocked that that's your opinion. How has New York dealt with the vote?
Well, the extraordinary thing is New York is closer than it has ever been. I was joking in the run-up, technically, it's not a swing state, so I can vote for Cornel West or whoever, but I ended up actually going in and voting for Kamala Harris, and I'm glad that I did because New York was shockingly close. I mean, to be clear, there was still, I think Kamala won by like 10%, but that is historically low, and it helps to contribute to actual real mandate that Donald Trump has received. Donald Trump is only the second Republican this century to win the U.S. popular vote. George W. Bush, in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, right before the backlash to his Iraq war hit, managed to win a popular vote, and Donald Trump won a popular vote. That is just how badly Joe Biden did. I think it's important to talk about Joe Biden for a second here, because that is who Donald Trump was running against. Kamala Harris was sort of a last ditch. And I've been thinking a lot over the past week, like, where was the screw up here? I think the screw up here was not, the initial screw up from which all of the other screw ups descended was not anything that actually happened during the Biden administration. The screw up took place in actually the spring of 2020 when the Democrats, during their nominating process, decided that they were scared enough of Bernie Sanders to just go running to Joe Biden. I think just the cataclysmic failure here, the fact that Donald Trump, one of the most unpopular men in American history, now has a popular vote majority, might have more to do with Joe Biden than anything else. I think that the narrative that certainly Joe Biden and his folks have been pushing for 4 years is that Joe Biden saved us from Donald Trump. But if you recall, the 2020 election results were actually quite surprising. Most pollsters, certainly most Democrats, and I think most people were expecting a landslide against Donald Trump. And that's not what we got in 2020. In fact, it was a much, much closer election. And I think, I've long suspected this, but I think the results this time around make it even clearer that actually nominating Joe Biden might have almost kept Donald Trump in power in 2020. In fact, the fact that Joe Biden was meant to be, was the standard bearer is actually something that led to this incredibly tiny margin that the Democrats had and led to the fact that not much actually got fixed during the period from 2021 to 2025. Do you ever, this is great, do you know who Bo Burnham is? Is he as popular across the Atlantic?
I've heard the name, yeah.
I think he started off on like YouTube and Vines and whatnot, and then he had a succession of really well-received...
Oh, yes, I do know.
Really well-received Netflix specials. He did probably what I think is probably one of the more impressive and moving pieces of work just about COVID, which is a bad thing to have because everybody wants to forget COVID. So it was actually probably a bad move long-term for Bo Burnham. But I think there's an outtake from that.
But he did well considering his constraints.
Growing up rich and being a white guy?
What
constraints?
No, I meant that he was able to film it pretty much on his own during COVID.
Yes, yeah. It was a great little special, but yeah, having the best COVID, the best piece of artwork around something that everybody wants to forget is perhaps not the best career move. But there was an outtake from it that's worth Googling. It's just...
They're really gonna make me vote for Joe Biden.
Is just the song. That's the whole song. Are they really gonna make me vote for Joe Biden? And that was how a lot of Democrats and a lot of Americans felt in 2020. And the reason this happened was out of fear of Bernie Sanders. I've never really been like a huge Bernie fan, but I think I am now fully converted to the Bernie would have won camp. And it would have been a lot better.
Well, the thing I'm hearing is a lot of people that had basically put their head in the sand and like to pretend that the internet didn't exist have just got to accept that it does exist. And one of the big things is they're saying, oh, we need our own Joe Rogan, as in like one that's very pro-democratic. And you're like, wasn't there a man that was incredibly popular with his base and on his show years ago that you didn't allow to run, aka Bernie Sanders? Like, it's almost as if they had this thing baked in that could have actually helped people and win. And then they went with, no, we'll just go with our establishment.
Exactly. And for those who may not be familiar with the specific history, this was actually applauded at the time. This was seen as like a very clever, smart thing to do that showed that the Democrats were better than the Republicans. In 2015, the way that Donald Trump took over the Republican Party was kind of fascinating. He just sort of was always ahead in the polls in the run-up to the 2016 nomination for the Republicans. But there were also always people who briefly had a little bit more than him. And what was perceived as the reason that Donald Trump became the Republican nominee was the fact that nobody else was willing to give up, that everybody kept on sniping at each other. And then Trump's just, support just slowly went up and up and up and up and up and up. And then all of a sudden, the Republicans found themselves shocked to be in late spring of 2016 and realizing that actually Donald Trump was who they had. So the Democrats thought they were really, really smart. In February, February of 2020, Bernie Sanders was looking like he's exactly in that position. Sure, other Democratic candidates would have little bursts, but Bernie just had this baseline of support that he was adding to. So after what is, I think, the first big primary in Iowa, there was some controversy there where, like, Mayor Pete Buttigieg sort of claimed that he had won Iowa, even though Bernie had. I can't speak to the minutia of that at this point. But after Iowa, it became very clear that Bernie had the most support out of anybody there. So the Democrats did the smart thing. They did the mature thing that the Republicans weren't able to do in 2015. They all dropped out immediately and endorsed Joe Biden.
Oh.
And I think in doing that, they guaranteed a anemic, not very useful mandate in 2020 because are you really going to make me vote for Joe Biden? And made it not inevitable. There were other great mistakes, but made it much, much more likely that Donald Trump got to pull off the Grover Cleveland and end up as the really, I mean, this era of politics will now be remembered as the Trump era, which is just kind of crazy to reflect on.
Sorry, just the amount of hatred there all seems to be for, all this bad podcasters and stuff. 4 years ago, Joe Rogan says he's voting for Bernie Sanders.
Yep.
Could you imagine how much they would have bitten people's hands off to get Joe Rogan to say, I'm going to vote Democrat this time around?
Oh, man.
But they were
So
like,
much.
no, let's join that guy that might actually help Americans.
And I think it's worth just as a thought experiment, like, what would have happened if Bernie had been president? Like, would we become socialist Venezuela? Would we all be in the People's Republic of America right now? Of course not. What would have happened is like the Bernie's socialism would have amounted to like 4 years without a tax cut, because Bernie, had he come to power in 2016 or 2020, would have had to deal with the U.S. Congress. like he would have gotten nothing through there, but he also wouldn't have been like running around the world looking for wars to start, which was the case under Trump and Biden. And he would have actually wanted to discuss real issues. 100%, we wouldn't have solved anything under Bernie, but we would have spent 4 years talking about housing costs, talking about medical costs, talking about housing costs, instead of all this like nonsense BS of foreign policy stuff that means nothing to the United States voter or taxpayer, other than it's a very expensive waste of money for the U.S. taxpayer, and without talking about any of this freaking Trump nonsense, because Bernie Sanders would have blown him out of the water.
Could it have been bringing things back to sort of a Keynesian sort of America that sort of emerged from World War II?
Well, I think we're already. I think I mean that's an interesting. So are we not?
Like, I'm sure he would have been able to get, some stuff through, and I can't see him doing a worse job than, he would have stood up to Israel a lot more, I think.
Yeah, well, it's not stand up to Israel. It would have been not bankroll a genocide. That's pretty straightforward.
Oh, yeah.
Also, Bernie Sanders.
Different thing.
Yeah, and the lack of imagination around what would have happened in the Middle East right now, is kind of shocking to me. Like, very few people are willing to come out and say, like, if we had an Iran nuclear deal, there wouldn't have been an October 7th. If we had Bernie Sanders as president, there wouldn't have been this sort of Abraham Accords nonsense that, went to all this effort to marginalize the Palestinians, which made the Palestinians feel like they had to do an October 7th. Like, it is a uniquely malign and stupid set of policies from both the Trump and Biden administrations that led to the historical catastrophe of October 7th and Israel's genocidal response to it. So, it's not like if Bernie Sanders was president, there probably never would have been an October 7th, because Bernie Sanders would not have let fricking Netanyahu continue to be the prime minister of Israel. It's important that, even the Biden administration was trying to get rid of Netanyahu. Netanyahu was briefly out of office, I think for under a year, but, maybe 10 months are there during the Biden administration.
There was a coalition for a small amount of time.
Exactly. Like, Bernie Sanders, it would have been incredibly clear to everybody in Israeli politics that they weren't going to be able to, that none of this sort of Judea and Samaria and annex and none of that crap was going to fly with Bernie Sanders. And he was going to be a lot less afraid than Joe Biden was of somebody going, "Oh, you're an anti-Semite." He'd be like, "What?" It's Apologize for my instinct to fall into like a Brooklyn Jewish stereotype there. But yeah, like it is like it would have nothing about the horrific set of circumstances that Trump and Biden allowed to be created that led to October 7th would have been there if Bernie Sanders had been president. So yeah, like it's just like this whole idea that the Democratic Party saved us from the socialism of Bernie Sanders because they wouldn't put it in those terms. But that, I think, is still the way a lot of people in the Democratic Party see what happened in 2020, when in fact what they did was they gave us a historically weak Democratic candidate to run up against a legitimate nightmare, which is Donald Trump.
How far back would you take Bernie Sanders until he would have just been considered a completely average politician and not really that remarkable? Because now he does come across as like this absolute radical.
Well, you'd have to be like in the 1970s to see him as like anything kind of normal. But that's sort of... So what parts of Bernie Sanders? Like if you're talking about Bernie Sanders' economic views, like that was what the Democratic Party was in the 1940s, 1950s. Really, Kennedy started to shift it in the 1960s. Kennedy's famous domestic accomplishment was a big tax cut, which is not what you generally associate with Democrats. But at that point, taxes arguably were like incredibly high. And it actually you can make an argument that was actually a good thing to do. But Johnson, of course, had a more, I think Johnson and Sanders had very, very similar politics. Jimmy Carter was much more sort of neoliberal or right-leaning or fiscally conservative than the Bernie Sanders of today. So probably I'd say the 1970s. I think Bernie Sanders could pass for probably wouldn't have been in Vermont in the 1960s, but he could pass for a somewhat run-of-the-mill. Well, of course, then you get in these weird questions like to be a Democrat in the 1960s, certainly in the 1950s, in a lot of cases meant to be a segregationist. So it gets confusing. But as far as the economic views that make Bernie Sanders such an out there crazy socialist, the Democratic Party up to say like the 1970s is fairly mainstream. Pro-union, pro-socialized medicine, like things like that. But yeah, it's an interesting question.
Can you tell us more about the sort of neocon conservative establishment within the Democratic Party that Bernie had to be sacrificed for in order to save? Because it feels like, the sort of Hillary Clinton types, it was all to protect their vision of the world.
So I think it's more neoliberal than neocon. I think the foreign policy, as we're seeing now and as we'll get to, it's just the same thing. It's complete monoparty. Donald Trump's like running as a peace candidate thing is nonsense that has been utterly punctured. Just we're recording this 8 days after the election. It's like there's no difference between Donald Trump and Joe Biden's foreign policy. There just isn't. So it's not so much foreign policy oriented. What it is, and this is a really important dynamic of what's been happening to the Democratic Party, is it's a shift towards being pro-business. It's a shift towards being pro-rich people. Not necessarily like crass billionaires like Elon Musk, this, that, and the other thing, but just generally they call it the PMC is a term you hear a lot, the professional managerial class, just sort of corporate, mid-level.
Davos types?
Well, Davos types those are legitimately wealthy people. Like, professional managerial class is just sort of like, the top 20%, I'd say. The people, the lawyers, the doctors. Well, actually, doctors are actually getting more and more radicalized and more interested in government getting more into medicine because that's such a mess. But stereotypically, sort of professors, those lead a little more left, but sort of middle managers, people who own houses in nice suburbs all over the country, largely whiter people. The PMC. These are the people that the Clintons really, really wanted to appeal to. This is, I call both Clinton and Obama Reaganites. They're, they're for the baby boomer yuppies or what have you. And this is the reason. It wasn't necessarily foreign policy oriented. These are the people that it really mattered to not have Bernie Sanders as the standard bearer of the Democratic Party. Bernie would have obviously been amazing for the middle class, working class, lower middle class, whatever you want to talk about it, folks who decided this election for Donald Trump. But Bernie definitely makes wealthy suburbanites, lower upper class suburbanites, which is a much larger class than the the sort of Davos types and the billionaires on top, were made nervous by Bernie Sanders. And it was that's who the Democrats were thinking of when they decided to marginalize Bernie Sanders. This actually, I've mentioned this theory before. I think I might have mentioned this in our last podcast on the election, but it as one of two ways that this could go. It seems like the polls were pretty correct, or actually were more, once again, underestimated the appeal of Donald Trump, because they said it was pretty much a toss-up. And though this election was not a landslide, I think toss-up is probably would be a little unfair to Donald Trump. Donald Trump has convincingly won this election. I don't think anybody expected him to be winning the popular vote.
But is it true that when Biden eventually gave up and let Kamala Harris have a chance, their internal polling was suggesting Republicans were going to get about 300 electoral college seats?
400. They really,
wow.
Yeah. Apparently, internal polling for the Democratic Party
based on that, Kamala Harris has done an incredible job.
Yeah, I'm not. I don't think Kamala Harris will ever run again. I don't think she's done in national politics, but I don't think.
Oh no, that's dead.
I don't think
everyone. It's just funny seeing everyone switch too. Because I know your support was very much like, I think she's the least likely to maximize genocide, but most people seem to think she was great. And it's a bit like any time somebody loses, oh, she was a terrible candidate, we couldn't stand her the whole time. But it definitely, if Joe had have said, look, I'm too old, I'm only running one time, let's do this properly and have a competition to see, what's the right term? Basically, to find out who's the best to replace me and run for election next time, should have been what's happened. But just Joe Biden's absolute greed and confidence in himself is what's destroyed this. This isn't Kamala's fault. She's done the best of what she had.
Exactly. And it's so frustrating because I was reading Matt Iglesias' postmortem, and I'm seeing this everywhere. It's like, well, you've got to understand that it's a bad environment post-COVID, for incumbents. Everybody's getting kicked out everywhere. It's like, yeah, well, not everybody was running against Donald Trump, It was such clear, insane malpractice to allow Joe Biden to do what he did and just sort of pretending, well, it's just it's just an anti-incumbent environment is such an infuriating cop-out to hear from people. But it just on that point of the professional managerial class and then Democrats becoming the party of the rich people, this is a real switch from the way it was. I'm in my 40s now, but in my 20s and my 30s, the way it was the wealthy suburbanites voted Republican based on tax cuts. Donald Trump has made a real shift, whereas wealthy suburbanites who've mostly gone to college can identify and mostly follow the news somewhat, can follow and see what a nightmare Donald Trump was and would never vote for Donald Trump. This misled a bunch of people into thinking there was some kind of inevitable Democratic victory here, because every election since the 2020 election has been really, really good for Democrats. And that's because of a special benefit that the Republicans used to have that the Democrats now have because of the class that has shifted to them. These wealthy, predominantly whiter suburbanites, almost all university educated, care more about politics, follow politics more closely, and are much more likely to vote in every kind of election except for the presidential election. A much larger slice of Americans get it together to go and vote for presidential elections. It's the rich and the educated who bother to show up for the midterm elections and the special elections and this, that, and the other thing. And I think that was the appropriate theory through which to understand this election. Getting excited about all the Dobbs effect and, the way that abortion had made all of the special elections and the midterm elections in 2022 surprisingly good results for the Democrats was because the Democrats now have the people who vote during the non-presidential elections and, of course, the presidential elections as well. But during the presidential elections, during the high turnout elections, it seems like it's now the Republicans that benefit more. It's important to caveat it's the Republicans under Donald Trump. It is way too early to tell.
Yes, Trump is incredibly strange.
It is a very unique thing, and is J.D. Vance going to be able to create this dynamic of, having Trump's coalition without Donald Trump? Well, we'll see. It's pretty clear that Ron DeSantis couldn't do it, Nikki Haley couldn't do it, and we've got a lot of information, even in this cycle, where the Republicans dominated so well, is that a lot of sort of Trumpite politicians didn't do so well. Kari Lake in Arizona, who's a very Trumpian, a woman, which of course makes it a bit harder, but has got that sort of, that she's a media figure, she's got that Trumpian panache of insanity, and she lost to a Democrat in the Senate race.
Well, Trump definitely has what's sometimes referred to politicians a rock star quality. Lots of people have tried to imitate his style and they just can't. Trump is an incredibly unique individual and can just make stuff like standing about for half an hour listening to YMCA manage to make you the most powerful man in the world.
So it's way too early to tell whether we're seeing a really a durable shift in the political parties. It's entirely possible, if we had a more normal...
Or will the Republican Party never get in power ever again because of this man? And once he's gone, it's just going to be like sand in your hands.
Well, but it's also entirely possible that if the Republicans nominate Nikki Haley, a lot of the professional management types, a lot of the wealthy suburbanites who like tax cuts, will just go back to Nikki Haley, and the Democrats won't have the people who like tax cuts or the working class that they've worked so hard to alienate across the Trump era. So maybe the Republicans win big. I mean, who's to say, really? We just don't know. And I think it's actually, in some ways, a little more democratic and a little more interesting to say that actually it's now election by election. This whole fantasy that the Republicans and the Democrats have been engaged in, that there's these sort of permanent coalitions that you have as the Republican or the Democratic Party, has been really just sort of exploded. You actually need to put together for every... I think that's kind of been in the Trump era, that's kind of been what it is. It's like the Democrats are like, well, we put together this carefully curated coalition on top of what we already have, and we try to win elections, and we just keep freaking losing to the Republicans, who actually have a candidate that appeals to people and promises things that people want. And I think perhaps the Democrats should invest in something like that.
But did he campaign better? Because people were saying they both had a bad campaign, but Trump just did the basic things. He went to the battle states. He just put in the hard work and talked for ages, and some people got bored and left. But Kamala did seem to kind of hide a bit more and not go to enough states that she should have. Just didn't do enough, door knocking and all the boring things you do in an election.
Well, I think it's different. So Hillary Clinton famously didn't go to Wisconsin much, didn't go to the Blue Wall that she lost much. And I think that Kamala Harris did the thing. She's a young, healthy 60-something by the standards of our modern presidential candidates. I think she just turned 60 or is about to, or something along those lines. She went from place to place. She was flying everywhere. She was doing all the talks. What the real contrast between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris is that Kamala Harris didn't step into a single environment that she couldn't control completely. She had the opportunity to go on Joe Rogan, and she was like, maybe I'll go on Joe Rogan if Joe Rogan flies out to meet me. And gives me a list of the questions. Donald Trump, you remember that incredibly embarrassing news cycle where he went to the NAACP? No, it wasn't the NAACP. It was the National Association of Black Journalists, I think. And he talked about black jobs and that sort of thing. Incredibly humiliating news cycle for him at this point. But in retrospect, it's like Donald Trump went into environments where he knew he wasn't going to get. And Kamala kind of did that. She went on Fox. But still, even today's Fox News operates within certain guidelines. Fox News was certainly never going to ask her
especially around presidential elections, isn't that right?
Well, yeah. Well, Fox News was never going to ask her about Gaza, was never going to ask her a negative question about Ukraine, was never going to, I'm sure if Kamala went on Rogan, it would be, like, so when did you know that Joe Biden was a vegetable? And when did, and what do you think about the genocide you're doing in Gaza?
And Joe Rogan is long. It's usually about 3 hours, which I feel like you can be prepared for a good hour, let's say, but it drags on. And there's something very personable about Joe Rogan, although, he's an incredibly wealthy, powerful man. It almost feels like it grinds you down. And obviously just those couple of seconds that you do have your guard down could go well and go around the internet and make you look incredible or be a disaster. But yeah, wouldn't take the risk. And I know you could talk about his character, but compared to a news anchor from, say, the 50s, the man's a saint in comparison to the racism and bigotry that, an average man or a man in any sort of power would have been like then.
Oh, are you kidding me? Joe Rogan is like, we live in the era of genocide, Rory. Joe Rogan is on a moral platform infinitely higher than anybody on Fox News, CNN, ABC, because Joe Rogan may interview awful genocidal people, but he also interviews people who say what's happening in Palestine is a genocide. Like, he actually interviews people who acknowledge humanity and what's going on. You will never see somebody go on MSNBC or Fox News or CNN who talks about the genocide the United States government is committing. So yeah, this idea that like Joe Rogan is somehow beyond the pale. No, Joe Rogan is beyond the pale because he's infinitely morally superior to all of the baby boomer bullshit media that we're supposed to be respectful of. He is infinitely, let's say this explicitly. Joe Rogan is infinitely above in moral standing, ability to look at himself in the mirror. He's a better person who runs a better media organization than any cable news channel in this country, because he will actually interview people who talk about the genocide that's happening in Israel. I think that's, and I don't think many people in the United States are explicitly thinking along those lines, but I think that is sort of where history is trending. And I think there's a lot of media organizations who don't have yet to reckon with that basic fact.
Do you think this has galvanized Joe Rogan as everyone that wants to be president has to have an interview with him now?
These things are hard to predict. Who knows? In 4 years' time, maybe we're all going to be watching AI chipmunks for our presidential news. Who knows? Like, it's entirely
okay
for this cycle. I think. I mean, I don't know. Like 4 years from now, Rory, we could be trying to work our way across an apocalyptic landscape, trying to figure out how to feed ourselves.
Yes, I did see a cyber taxi get graffitied, which was very cyberpunk.
A cyber taxi got,
one of those
that is very cyberpunk.
One of those robot taxis.
Sure.
And because the taxi has a thing where it won't move if it sees pedestrians, it means then if you just stop and then start writing on it, and then the people are locked inside, so they just have to sit there while you graffiti this car. It's very bizarre.
Oh, that is quite amusing. We live in a cyberpunk future, man. If you want to talk about cyberpunk, and why not? I think Elon Musk I'm just in awe of what a strange character Elon Musk is. If William Gibson, the father of cyberpunk literature, cyberpunk, for those who don't know, is a genre of science fiction from the 1980s. Neil Stephenson, William Gibson, talking about what the internet might mean, what its impact on society might be. And yeah, Elon Musk is stranger than any fiction that they imagined.
Very Blade Runner and early RoboCop would be very cyberpunk, in my opinion.
Yeah. So I've been a sci-fi guy, or at least a comic book guy, for my entire life. And I remember as a teenager in the 1990s, or even, reading science fiction in my 20s in the early aughts, the general idea of a lot of this science fiction was that corporations would become more powerful than governments. And I always sort of thought this kind of a fanciful, kind of a silly idea. Like, what are you talking about? Like, McDonald's is going to be more important than the Pentagon? This just seems silly to me, because these were or Exxon seemed a little less silly, the way that it interacted with a lot of global South governments at the time. But it didn't seem very likely, or it didn't seem very plausible. With the rise of these big tech companies that on a lot of levels are sort of everything companies. I mean, Google seems like it is now the market leader in those robo-taxis you're talking about, which is kind of surprising.
Yeah.
So like we really are getting to this place of these everything companies, and Elon Musk is just, people do not recognize how powerful this guy is. And I think there's a real instinct.
Well, definitely now.
Well, yes, definitely now. But even before he chose to make Trump his next little passion project, Elon Musk was a lot more powerful than any U.S. president, and a lot more sort of permanently. Musk himself and other people were fantasizing about like, oh, wow, if Trump loses, Elon Musk's in a lot of trouble. He can't be. He's kind of got the U.S. government over a barrel. Tesla is important and makes a lot of money, and it is interesting. Full disclosure, I own some Tesla stock. Has a lot to do with how this project can continue, even though it's not really that successful. But
I, by the way, don't.
yes. Well, you own some crypto, right? It's been a good couple of weeks.
Yes, we're at two ends of the coin. I seem to have a lot of what we refer to as altcoins. But it is staggering because I have that little app that says when the things go up. So it seems to be like every 6 hours. Currently, Bitcoin has hit an all-time high.
Yep.
It's affecting the other coins a bit, but not that much. It is staggering what's happening. Also, when I consider that I always find Elon Musk very late to the party. I think he kind of begrudgingly got involved and kept claiming he was something to do with Doge, which Doge is literally a joke coin that was made by a guy that found Bitcoin kind of weird like 8 years ago and made this thing. And what was strange is it's linked to another coin called Litecoin. Mm-hmm. So he made this project, forgot about it, lived his life. And because it's attached to this other thing that exists, it kind of means it's taken on a weird life of its own, purely because it was a bit of a joke and early on. And somehow Elon Musk used to just joke about, being involved. Yeah. Well, and now he's got really involved to the point where the government document that may destroy your country, Rob, is got the acronym Doge, because, isn't that hilarious?
Yeah, I don't really want to go too far down the crypto rabbit hole here, but my point is that
not
Tesla,
Project 2025.
We can talk about that too. Tesla is a interesting company that has been very successful, but SpaceX is the United States space program, and that's not just, as I think people minimize it as like, oh, maybe we'll go to the moon and Musk wants to go to Mars. All of this new Cold War stuff, a lot of this jack up in U.S. defense spending is around space. Space Command, not Space Command, there's like a new space department.
Space
or
Force?
Something. Space Force, yeah. It's a whole new administrative division of the U.S. military. Space Force, Space Command, used to be Command, now it's Space Force. All of this stuff, billions, and eventually over the course of the decade, trillions of dollars in investment. That's all Elon Musk. It's all going to Elon Musk.
But you did hear about Jeff Bezos with the Washington Post?
Well, I'm aware of it, but I just on the Elon Musk thing. So that's all Elon Musk. All this money there are other space companies. Jeff Bezos has a space company, but none of them can do what SpaceX can do at this point. And he's got not just plans on the books, but functioning rocket platforms that are going to take up his capabilities by another order of magnitude. And beyond all that, he's also set up Starlink, which is like the truly global internet, which is very important to, among other things, Ukraine's ability to prosecute a war against Russian aggression. This guy is absurdly powerful. And I think you can make a pretty good case that he's in the process of losing his mind. Sorry, just on the topic of cyberpunk.
Wow.
That is about as cyberpunk as you can imagine. So yeah, that's an aspect of this. And for those of you who may not be aware of the connection, Elon Musk over the past 3 to 6 months has decided that Donald Trump was his pet project. And I think there's been a lot of people sort of recognizing that as much as we don't want to, Elon Musk has tremendous credibility beyond us sort of snooty coastal liberal elites who don't like what he did to Twitter, and actually him lending that credibility to Donald Trump been a huge factor in Trump's success. And it's kind of a different question. People are like, oh yeah, can't wait for Elon Musk and Donald Trump to fall out. That's going to be hilarious. It's not like, Trump falling out with John Bolton or some other underling who works for him. Trump falls out with Elon Musk, he's kind of out with a big section of the U.S. military, which is not somewhere Donald Trump can be out with and defend, the U.S. Department of Agriculture. He cannot offend the entirety of the U.S. military's anti-China strategy, which Elon Musk is absolutely integral to. So yeah, it's a very weird, I think I need to talk a little bit more about Elon Musk, maybe in a produced video sometime soon, because I don't think people...
Okay.
It's funny. It's like hilarious kind of, but it's also deeply, deeply disturbing and has some kind of long-term implications for U.S. democracy that are far more significant than anything else Donald Trump is involved in. To the extent where kind of 2020 to 2024 could have been the last chance for a U.S. president to do anything against Elon Musk, and it's now gone. That's kind of an interesting.
You're making out to be much worse than I guess most people even feared.
Yeah, people are like, oh, he's a joke. He's not really an engineer. He doesn't know how to do anything. And it's like, no, man, this is one of the most impressive people of the century anywhere in the world. And yeah, he's losing his fucking mind. And that's a real problem because, there's certainly no guardrails against Donald Trump, the U.S. president. There are even fewer guardrails against this guy who owns the entire U.S., basically the only parts of the U.S. military-industrial complex that are worth a damn. We talk a lot about how the United States military has failed completely in Yemen, failed completely in Ukraine. There are bright spots in the U.S. military-industrial complex that speak to the continued ability of the United States to exert military force around the planet. Those bright spots are entirely Elon Musk. Entirely.
Wow.
So yeah, we don't need to do an Elon Musk episode.
I was going to say, what do you think of Trump's defense appointee?
There was this incredible faith. What's the triumph of hope over experience, and I guess a lot of really naive people who were like, oh, Trump's the anti-war candidate, and a lot of libertarians who sort of allowed themselves to get sort of gulled into that position. It's like, oh, well, no, Trump's really the anti-war one. Da, 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 da. And Trump, because the Democrats were so incredibly negligent that they left the sort of pro-peace lane completely open for Donald Trump, he went crazy with it in the last couple of weeks of the election. He was going to Michigan to do events with Muslim affinity groups who wanted to talk about the genocide in Gaza, which is kind of insane. That he was at the same time taking hundreds of millions of dollars from Miriam Adelson and at the same time going to Detroit being like, sure. I mean, yeah, politicians are always trying to be everything to all people, but to truly be on differing sides of a genocide and telling them both I'm here for you is a pretty extraordinary thing that perhaps
classic British trick.
Yeah, and I this is another aspect of this is the extent to which we've got media malpractice here. This is a hobby horse of mine. The incredible pro-Republican, pro-bias of every media source. They're just sort of Trump runs as an anti-war candidate without any indication of without any discussion of how his first term actually went, how he's never ended
the fact
a single
that he fired
war.
The most missiles since America started recording in 2005.
I think that's true. The drone war, Obama's careful, meticulous drone war. He sent into the stratosphere, let the generals do whatever he wanted. And there were, I think, a lot of people, certainly enough people to swing the election towards Donald Trump, thought that he was the pro-peace candidate. And there are people within the MAGA movement, within Donald Trump's camp, including, apparently, hilariously, Donald Trump Jr., a figure that, we all were able to forget about for 4 years, but his sort of the first of his fail sons, generally seen as kind of a guy perpetually living in his much more outsized father's shadow and rather a sad version. One way that Donald Trump Jr. has sort of created meaning for himself is by sort of cozying up to more libertarian wings of the MAGA movement. He seems to be the child that's most interested because he has so little else going on in the political aspects. And he has sort of positioned himself as the anti-neocon guy. in the Donald Trump camp. And over the weekend, we actually got some pretty extraordinary news. I think you're well aware that I dramatically dislike Mike Pompeo, the guy who was most loyal to loyal to Donald Trump. In some ways, he always kissed Donald Trump's ass, but actually kind of sabotaged any peace-oriented attempts in the first Trump administration. This weekend, we found out that he wasn't getting a job with the new Trump administration, which is amazing news. Tom Cotton, truly disgusting whore for the defense industry in the U.S. Senate, also not getting a big job in the Trump administration. And Nikki Haley, someone who I was kind of excited about when she was the governor of one of the Carolinas, but then joined the Trump administration and, basically started learning about foreign policy from a bunch of neocons and just had the worst foreign policy you could imagine. All three of those people this past weekend, were uninvited from the Trump administration, which was really exciting news. I even texted a pro-Trump family member of mine being like, holy cow, this is amazing. And by Tuesday of this week, I guess this will be last Tuesday from when this is published, all of that came to nothing because of the people that he has been. Now, it's important to point out this drama, and Donald Trump is nothing if not a drama queen. He is announcing all of these big ticket appointments relatively early, just a week after the election. I think this is seen as a correction from the way things were the last time around, where he wasn't really expecting to be president and didn't have any plans. So he's actually, we're hearing about this and discussing this earlier than we expected. So it's entirely possible that a lot of these big ticket nominees won't actually make it to the Senate floor or will be turned down at the Senate floor. But as of Tuesday, as of 6 days after his election, Donald Trump had chosen a wide array of just mind-blowingly pro-genocide, pro-war people. Just absolutely brain-dead militarists, the lot of them. So this is kind of interesting. As of this recording, Marco Rubio has been sort of rumored to be the Secretary of State, but it doesn't appear, at least as of this recording, that there's an official announcement of it. So there may be some pushback against Marco Rubio, who is absolutely a standard neocon, standard warmonger So I think the important distinction is that neocons actually want to do nation building and actually want to, recreate societies. Warmongers just want to blow things up. Marco Rubio just wants to blow things up. And so to have this guy as the Secretary of State would be really appalling, frankly. The National Security Advisor, who I do not believe has to be approved by the Senate. I think this is just somebody that the president hires. I could be wrong about that. The National Security Advisor, just this guy reading out, he's just a dope. Just this guy literally wanted to reinvade Afghanistan, and is a huge supporter of, wants to practice. He hasn't actually said this, but you get the sense that he'd like to put U.S. troops on the ground in Ukraine, just a comically anti-libertarian, anti-peace guy. And that's the one that sort of really sort of tears it for me. This is not a guy who's going to get shot down by the Senate. This is Trump's pick for National Security Advisor, is a guy who would be embarrassingly warmongering for the George W. Bush administration. So yeah, it is simply the myth of Donald Trump's pro-peaceness is gone. And I don't honestly expect the defense secretary nominee, Pete Hegseth, to make it to the Senate. It just seems
he also once threw an axe at a drummer by accident.
Yes. Pete Hegseth is a Fox News columnist who is, to my mind, most famous for convincing Donald Trump to pardon a bunch of convicted U.S. war criminals. So U.S. soldiers that were so egregious in their crimes that the Pentagon decided to prosecute and convict them. Donald Trump pardoned them because Pete Hegseth convinced them to. He's also a big fan of privatizing the the Veterans Affairs Administration. We actually give free health care to veterans in the United States. He wants to privatize that and give it to the insurance companies to make money off of, which is
because that always works out well.
They truly mind-blowingly awful nominee that is so bad that I think you could easily find the 4 or 5 Republicans you need to vote against him. So yeah, I don't think he's actually going to be our Secretary of Defense.
I've also heard there can be, this was with UK politics, with people being in charge of defence, is sometimes if someone's been in the military, when they then get a position like this, they take a lot of the baggage they had in that position, and then they almost feel like they've worked hard enough to reach like top rank when they haven't. It's just like a weird, bizarre, you happen to know someone and they thought you'd be good at the job. So it can be really horrible for defence to have someone like this because they think they know better than everyone when there's a very good chance he doesn't.
Yeah, and I think the problem with... I'm not against having soldiers as secretaries of defense if they've done something else since. I think it's actually very good.
He's worked at Fox.
Yeah, sure. But like, I think it's good for someone who, you know, in their youth spent 5 to 10 years in the military and then went on and did other things to become the Secretary of Defense. I'd argue that's even preferable, that they've had some experience. But like, being in the military is not the real world. That's not at all like a sense of disrespect. It is a heightened version of, it is an incredibly much more dangerous world that I was too chicken to participate in. I have infinite respect, but you are not actually seeing the world. You are not learning anything about the world by being in the military. You are learning how to kill people and how to keep yourself from being killed.
Particularly in the American military, because their bases are so incredible, it can feel like you haven't really gone abroad.
Exactly. It is no disrespect to the people who choose to do that, and you know, thank them for their service or what have you. But like, these are not people who understand even how the U.S. military interacts with these other countries. So, and I think that Pete Hegseth is a guy who has made a career of presenting the most blinkered and absurdly over-militarized sense of the world and appropriate policies. So yeah, just a bad news, bad idea kind of guy. But this is the first of what, 200 weeks? 200 and I guess 200 weeks of Trump that we've got ahead of us.
That's one way of putting it.
200 plus, right?
Yeah, but he might change the laws so he could run in a third term.
Yeah, I don't think so. It's interesting today. Apparently, Trump and Biden had like a really chummy, friendly meeting. So yeah, this is the guy who's going to destroy democracy, the new Hitler aborting, and Joe Biden's like yucking it up with him. So yeah, I think a lot of that stuff was always kind of BS.
Could I run something past you?
Of course.
How much control? Apparently, so Joe Biden did turn the economy around, but most Americans didn't feel like they felt it. And basically what all the research has suggested is because groceries kept going up. It was something that was tangible, they could see every day, and it hit them every week. What could he have done to just say, look, I want this to stay as it was. I don't want the price to go up for the average American. Is there anything he could do, considering he could, send man to the moon?
There are a lot of things he could have done. I mean, Richard Nixon did price controls. But that we're a long, long away. Like what they call the Overton window, the idea of acceptable things for a U.S. president to do,
a society,
has shifted a great deal since the 1970s. What he could have done, and I talked about this in a video I did on the YouTube channel, just sort of how Biden lost, which goes into a lot more detail on a lot of these things. I talked about how Joe Biden actually took away a lot of benefits from the American citizens because there were a lot of benefits around pauses on student debt payments, the child tax credit, that Donald Trump provided in, almost inadvertently in the CARES Act, that big bit of COVID stimulus. With the American Recovery Plan in 2021, Biden added to and in some cases expanded some of these benefits, the child tax credit specifically, and then it all went away. All those stimulus programs ended. So in addition to the prices being higher, Joe Biden actually took benefits away that people had enjoyed and really been like, oh, wow, this is what a real welfare state might have been like. And sure, we know that it was more the Republicans or Joe Manchin or Kristen Sinema, the anti-people Democrats that took away those benefits, but Joe Biden was the guy in charge. So it wasn't just the fact that the prices went up and they never came down. It's that Joe Biden stripped away a lot of government benefits that Donald Trump gave to the American people. And so it goes beyond just the inflation. After he lost the House of Representatives, I think Biden had the House of Representatives for the first 2 years. Is that correct? He kind of decided he was just going to be a foreign policy president with quite nightmarish results. And he shouldn't have made that decision.
Isn't foreign policy something a lot of Americans, it generally ranks quite low on opinion polls of what they're voting for?
Presidents care a lot about foreign policy because that's where they see their legacy being set. It's just more interesting. I mean, how much time do we spend on foreign policy on this podcast versus domestic politics? It's a lot. It's not what's important to people, but it's a lot more interesting. And it can. Yeah. It's foreign policy is real freaking important to the Ukrainians or the Palestinians. It can.
The Venezuelans.
Get very, very important. It was very important to Americans during World War II. Can get very important, but it's the risk reward is so high, and presidents really just love, and it's just easier for presidents to do things. They believe they can impact it more, even though that's not always true. So yeah, the politicians are always a lot more interested in foreign policy than the people are.
So would you like to have a podcast where we talk about some of America's potential foreign policy?
We can do exactly that. Yes.
So thank you very much for listening to us, and I wish you all the best with your new leader of the free world.
Indeed.
Ciao, ciao. Catch you next time.
Delightful.
The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire, What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.